So I myself am a massive Dungeons & Dragons fan. I've been playing it since I was a kid. I've been involved in campaigns with good friends of mine and my wife for sometimes 3-4 years at a time. I watch a lot of actual play like Dimension 20 and Critical Role, and I don't think I'm alone in saying that I was cynical about this movie. When it was announced, I was almost angry, if I'm honest. I didn't like the idea of something that I loved so much being a joke. I know what happened with the previous Dungeons & Dragons movie and how bad that was. And I didn't know how they would pull off a movie that was Dungeons & Dragons without being campy, but also being good fantasy and good action. Or how it would actually be Dungeons & Dragons and not just like Lord of the Rings, just another fantasy thing like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or God forbid, Aragon. But if you look at the team of directors and writers we have behind this, we have John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. For those of you that don't know who John Francis Daley is, you probably know him as the nerd from Freaks and Geeks or the saddest part of Bones.
The world's a lot better than you think it is. It's...
But what a lot of people don't know is behind the scenes, he is responsible for writing on Spider-Man Homecoming, Horrible Bosses, along with Jonathan Goldstein for those. And they're both responsible for writing and directing Game Night, probably one of the last good full-blown comedy movies that we have gotten.
There was a special on these tonight. 3 for 1.
3 for 1?
Yep.
How can that be profitable for Frito-Lay?
So because of that, I was less nervous. And going into this, I had kind of an anxious excitement about if it was going to live up to what I wanted and if it was going to represent this passion of mine to what it needed to be. And you know fucking what? I loved it. I was blown away. I had a blast. I was laughing my ass off. The action was amazing. The fantasy was good. There were moments in it where I was like, this is 100% Dungeons & Dragons and not just fantasy. And I can also tell that it's enjoyable enough for you to watch if you don't give a shit about Dungeons & Dragons. So they nailed it, and I cannot wait to talk more about it. So Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves is a fantasy, comedy, action, drama, whatever you want to call it, movie that follows 4 characters, our party members, as they go on a quest to stop the big bad guy in the world. The big bad guy in the world that used to be a partner of theirs, from partnering up with a big evil witch lady that wants to turn everybody else into like zombies basically, and they're also after some money and some redemption and to escape the law. It's a whole big thing. It makes sense in the moment, but now looking back and trying to describe it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the plot, although interesting, and I do kind of care about it, is the least important part of this movie. Like I said, the important part of this movie is being Dungeons & Dragons without just being fantasy, but still being fun to watch if you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons. And what they did was they made Guardians of the Galaxy, but fantasy. And that's not a bad thing. I understand saying, oh, they just made Guardians of the Galaxy, but instead of sci-fi, they made fantasy, might seem like a knock, but it's not. This has been tried before. They made a Dungeons & Dragons movie, and it was fucking terrible.
I hate this place. This zoo, this prison, this reality.
Guardians of the Galaxy is the bones and the foundation that this was built upon. You know, the structure of comedy, action, story point, comedy. These characters get along this way. You have our goofy but hot and lovable kind of badass main character. You have the badass warrior lady. You have the team getting together to go on this quest kind of reluctantly together. And you have Bradley Cooper playing somebody small. But the difficult thing to capture about Dungeons & Dragons is the comedy. At the end of the day, everybody starts a Dungeons & Dragons campaign wanting to be badasses and have these amazing fantasy quests and do Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones just with their friends sitting on a table imagining these amazing scenarios. But what it always boils down to is it's a lot of improv comedy bits between close friends.
This guy, it's weird because you are a half-orc. This guy could be your dad.
Dad?
And the only way to really get that down is by having that Guardians of the Galaxy but fantasy element, because that improv does not work unless you nail down how to do it in a formulaic way that you care about the story and the action is good as well. Another way they nailed that, though, is the characters. In this, we have Chris Pine playing Edgin, our bard, Michelle Rodriguez playing Holga, our barbarian, who, by the way, is actually a really good actress. I enjoyed her so much in this. The only thing I've seen her in like the past 20 years is Fast and Furious movies, and nobody has to be a good actor to be in those. In fact, they take good actors and make them bad actors in those. And seeing her in this, I'm like, holy crap, she's a badass, but she's also hilarious. But either way, we have Reggie Jean Page as Zenk, our paladin, who is with them briefly. Justice Smith as Simon, our sorcerer. Sophia Lillis as Doric, our druid. And Hugh Grant as Forge, our rogue turned bad guy, because, you know, it's in a rogue's nature. Now, these are the perfect actors, especially having Chris Pine lead this. Like, if you were to tell me, pick one actor to lead a Dungeons & Dragons movie or pick one actor to replace Chris Pratt, it would be Chris Pine. And I'm going almost exclusively off of his Star Trek role, where he plays essentially the same character of this badass wisecracker that is put into a leadership role, even though he doesn't seem like he should be in the leadership role, but does very well and discovers morality and all like that. It's the classic main character that's also comedic role. And it helps that Chris Pine is just naturally hilarious. He doesn't seem to have to try to make things funny. Like Hugh Grant, although is quite funny in this, is very clearly being told, hey, Hugh Grant, read these funny lines. There's nothing wrong with that, but Chris Pine is just funny. He doesn't try to be funny. He is funny. But the beautiful thing about these characters is that you can feed them into a stat sheet for Dungeons & Dragons. Like, I could tell you which one of these characters are dumb but have really high fight skills. I can tell you which one of them are charming but you wouldn't put a sword in their hands. You can tell when they do combat when they would roll a nat 20 and when they would roll a nat 1. It feels like a D&D party. These feel like 4 characters that friends made and are playing together, especially with the banter and the fact that they all complement each other while having weaknesses, and it's very well done in that way. I also really enjoyed like the sneaky D&D things that they put in here. Like the thing that stood out in my mind, like as soon as it was happening, as something that may not be obvious to somebody that's not a D&D fan but would still be funny, is the bridge moment. When the paladin that is leading them through the quite literal dungeon to get to the artifact that they need comes up to a bridge and starts to explain an overly complex sequence of events and a puzzle that they have to do. And then the sorcerer accidentally destroys the entire thing, and then a minute later they pull out a staff that just allows you to teleport over there. Just screamed D&D to me. Like the paladin would be the dungeon master that created this super elaborate puzzle, and then the players fucked it up, and on a whim he had to be like, roll perception. You find a staff that allows you to teleport. Now you can get over and get the artifact. It was great. I loved what they did there. But then obviously you had more obvious things like the mimic in the maze. I thought was brilliant. You had the gelatinous cube, which is also part of Dungeons & Dragons. You had an owl bear, which I've never seen a actual representation in a movie, and that was amazing. And on top of that, this world itself feels like a D&D world. It doesn't just feel like a fantasy setting. Like it kind of feels, not this, I don't mean this in an insulting way, but small in scale and scope. You don't really see anything outside of a couple individual villages and then the city center and palace. They don't really go out and explore. You don't hear or care too much about the world. None of this world really makes sense because it's just for these players to live in briefly. And I like that. Once again, it makes sense. It's what makes this Dungeons & Dragons not fantasy. Does that make sense? But anyway, I love what they did here. John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein absolutely nailed the vibe of this. I figured if anybody could, they would be able to. All of these actors were perfectly cast in this. The story was wonderful. The D&D elements were fantastic. The humor, the action, everything nailed what it had to nail. And I watched this once, and then right afterwards, I watched it again. And that right there tells you the story you need to know. And honestly, I kind of hope they do a second one. I think this was a flop. Let me check. Oh, never mind. It did pretty good. $208 million. That's pretty good. And from what I understand, this created quite a buzz as time went on. And I think, if anything, if this doesn't get a sequel and become a franchise, which usually I don't root for franchises, but I'd be okay with this, I think it'll become a cult classic. Like, I'm calling it now. In 2023, this movie will be a cult classic. But thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Check out my other videos.